Hello. Today we're meeting together to raise the question, can we teach values in the schools? My name is Noel Schewel. I'm in the Department of Curriculum and Instruction at Memorial University, and my special interest is religious education. On my left is our special guest visiting the university from the University of London. Edwin Cox is Reader of Education and head of the Religious Education program at the University of London. Next is James Covert from the Department of Educational Foundations at Memorial University. Next, Lloyd Brown, Department of Curriculum and Instruction at Memorial, and special interest in reading and children's literature. And finally, Jeffrey Jones from the Department of Curriculum and Instruction at Memorial University with a special interest in social studies. Perhaps the first thing we should turn our attention to, Edwin, is this an important question at all?
Well, it seems to be creating an interest throughout the world. Since I came to Newfoundland about 10 days ago, a great many people have wanted to talk about it. There is interest too in Sweden and Denmark, where I've been this year to talk. I'm getting students from New Zealand and Japan, where they're all concerned about what we're going to talk about, values. They may call it moral education, but this is a worldwide interest, and we might care to consider why the interest has been aroused so acutely at the present time.
Do you find that the moral values is the topic that they're concerned with, or is it values in general, or can we differentiate between moral values and other kinds of values?
Well, I think we ought to define what we mean by values. There are different kinds of values, aren't there? There are economic values, by which we decide our salary scales and whether we buy a coat in the stores or not. And there are aesthetic values, which I think Lloyd is concerned with in literature. And there are social values. We ought to decide what we mean here. On the whole, when people talk about values in school, they really mean moral ones. Generally, they mean helping the kids to be obedient and industrious and non-violent and so on. Is this what you got in mind?
Is that the same thing as the old character building that we envision in the fine British schools of old?
I don't know if I can answer that one. Yes, I suppose that is what is thought about. Whether we can do that any longer, whether we're in a situation where that type of character building is possible, I would question. I think behind most people's demand for values in school, there is some kind of idea that we know what we want, what the good Christian gentleman and woman is, and we want to fashion him.
I'm interested in your observation that there is a great deal of interest in values education. Why do you think that there is such an interest now?
I was asking you shot it back at me. I think it is a twofold thing, Lloyd. First of all, we have been hit by the full impact of technology in the last 50 years or so. We now have ways of living, traveling, which we didn't have before. Secondly, we have mixed up, as a result of that travel, we've mixed up our cultures. We go to visit each other's lands, people come and live among us. There's been tremendous mixing of world cultures. And this has led to a confusion of values. We now have a pluralistic society, where a great many values are accepted and lived up to. And we're trying to find some kind of path through this jungle of values that technology and travel has produced for us. I don't know whether you'd agree with that, Jeff, as a sociologist.
The question I was going to ask really revolved around whether perhaps there is an order of values that could be classified as higher order, as distinct from perhaps lower order values. What you seem to be saying is that there are values pertinent to different disciplines, and that these are in conflict. And I'm perhaps wondering whether there are other sorts of values in keeping with my idea that I just expressed, that are also in conflict, and it may well be these that are causing some of the problems that we have in the world these days.
Yes, I'm not sure I follow what you've just said, but your previous remark about hierarchy of values, I would agree with. It seems to me that if you take any of the more superficial values and ask why do we accept that as a value, you are pushed back into some kind of moral area. For instance, Lloyd, as an expert of literature, said, you should value Keats' poem Ode to Autumn. And I say, why should I value that? He cannot give me a literary answer. And usually we are then pushed back into some kind of moral order, and I therefore would regard moral values as being the primary ones, of which the others are expressions in particular areas.
So therefore you're saying then perhaps that as a basis for the teaching of values, if this is to be a viable school experience, that perhaps it rightfully should fall into the area of religious studies rather than perhaps literature or social studies or educational foundations?
Clearly philosophical, clearly philosophical.
Well, you're the philosopher. Would you like to answer?
I was wondering if it wouldn't help perhaps if we differentiated between social norms and these first order values that you were referring to.
Yeah, it would help.
Perhaps what we teach too often in schools are, well, this is what the society does. These are the norms of the society, and this is what you look like when you're breaking them. But you're really concerned with something more than that.
Oh, yes, I think these deeper things are what we should be teaching. Otherwise, we're just conditioning children to behave in a particular way without knowing why they're doing so. And that really brings us back to Jeff's question, do you do it by religion? Well, we used to. When you had a homogeneous religious society, everyone in that society would accept those religious values and live them out in practice. But now we have a society where certain people are not religious. And I wouldn't myself like to tie value education entirely to religious education any longer. Religious education will work for those in a religious milieu who can respond to it. But what about the others? You may not have others in Newfoundland, but we certainly have in Britain. And therefore it seems to me this is a wider thing of which religious education is a part. I would want to examine, I children to examine where they get their values from. Some of them will come from just living in the society because the society is expressing those values in its life. Some of them will, for a number, will come from religion. Religion is pretty hot on its values if you belong to it, and it will be operative for some. But for others, too, it will come from personal experiences. My answer to your question, Jeff, is that religion is a part of it, but I wouldn't put the whole onus of value education onto the religious instructor. I don't know whether Noel, in this area, would agree with this.
Well, I think what's clear from the discussion so far, certainly, is that the kinds of values that religion would deal with is only one realm of value. And even the introduction, for example, of a notion of social norms touches upon, if you will, these represents a batch of objects, so to speak, in a very general sense, or activities, whereby society, generally speaking, is making judgments that such things are more valuable than other things. And those such things, whether called social norms or social values, it seems to me are functioning in about the same realm. Now, religious values are only a portion of that, it seems.
Yeah, so haven't you raised what is a fundamental thing there now, that we're in an age when social norms are not universal. They're norms for sections of society. And this is our problem. How do we teach them in schools when children come from all sections? It's one of the paradoxes, isn't it, that if you have a moral society, you don't need to teach moral education. Children pick it up from the values of people around them, lives around them. But when you get not an immoral, but a society that's confused about its morality, where there are a diversity of social norms, they immediately begin to say, let the schools teach the norms. And what we're raising is, A, what are the norms you're asking the school to teach? And B, can we teach them in that situation anyway?
Or what about, for instance, just go back to Jim's notion that there are, I gathered he was trying to get at, that there are social norms, but in some sense, I don't think he thought that values education ought to be only concerned with social norms, but with something else. I mean, for instance, it seems to me that a part of values education may be to question social norms, for instance.
Or to discover where they came from.
Or to discover where they came from, to create others, perhaps.
Yeah.
So what was the other that you were thinking of, apart from social norms, or was it just that you thought that the dimension of not just introducing them to what is, but where they came from and a certain questioning attitude towards it?
Yes, I think that what I'm concerned about is not merely a clarification of the norms that kids have, but really a further exploration of how did they come by these norms, and what part does the teacher play in enunciating the proper, I don't want to call them norms, the proper activities that they ought to engage in. So the norms must have come from somewhere. You have said they might come from experience, or they might come from their environment or association with people.
Yeah.
And I'd like more clarification on those two. And then perhaps if we understand what these norms are, what is the role of the teacher in putting forward her position or his position, as well as the norms of the society?
Yeah. Now, you've asked me 4 questions at
least,
once. Yes. First of all, how are values or norms acquired in individuals? B, can we make this a part of a teaching process? C, should a teacher dictate what norms the pupils are to have? D, should a teacher confess what his own norms are? Well, that'll take us the rest of the afternoon. The more important one, I think, is how are values acquired? This is a psychological question. No doubt psychologists would be able to say more than we could about it. But I'm not sure we know enough about this. My own theory is that, sort of looking into myself and see how my judgments are formed, it's through almost random experience in the past. Sometimes not by in schools, not by what the teacher has said or in his structured lesson, but just from the way in which he's behaved and acted, you see. I've got in mind a French master. He taught me a certain amount of French. He was a keen musician who often went into digressions about music, and I learned, I'm sure many of my musical judgments were influenced by that, quite unintentionally. And I think people pick up their norms from these random things, from things parents say at odd moments, from things peer groups say. And it's very difficult to know how to structure it. And the question whether you can do it in schools is one which I would fairly severely question, because it is such a random process. As regards the other thing, should the teacher dictate?
Well, could I,
sorry,
before answering
yes, keep us in order. Keep us in order.
It's one thing to, what you've described basically is a process whereby values are demonstrated through the lives or in the lives or through the personality of some a teacher or a parent or a peer or whatever. And because of the power of that influence, one kind of accepts it.
Yes.
But surely that's not the only experiential way out of experience or inexperience that a person uses to acquire values, because it seems to me there's also a process where even the most influential person can demonstrate something, and part of my experience, at least in shaping values, is raising the question in my own mind, is that a good thing to do? And good, sometimes morally, sometimes aesthetically, sometimes economically, sometimes religiously, where it's more than simply receiving from the society, but rather this another part of the process would seem to be the injection of oneself personally into the process as a possible creator of values.
Yes. There are two parts to it, isn't there? There's the acquiring of values, which may be pretty random. There's the realization that you've acquired them. There's the criticism of them, possibly even the modification, sometimes the rejection and replacement of them. It's a highly intellectual process. You're an intellectual man, you do it. I'm not sure that everyone else does. But this is, I'm sure, what we can do in schools, helping students through simulation games, role play, discussion, to realize what society is doing to them and to be critical of it. This is, I would try and make part of the program, though I hope you're not going to press me too closely at this stage as to what type of material one would use in a classroom, because I don't think any of us have got round to thinking that out yet.
I'd like to pick up on that point just briefly and ask you whether that means that the teacher must be a particularly moral person.
Not necessarily. A teacher is terribly influential when children at certain ages, but not at other ages. And now, during that influential age, his moral judgments, I'm thinking particularly when they're very young children, will be most formative. Later on, at adolescence, as children grow up and are trying to become autonomous, they tend to react against teacher. I wouldn't want to lay on teachers the burden of thinking they've got to be frightfully moral. Sometimes an immoral teacher can help the students by the very fact that they react against him and criticize him. On the other hand, don't ever give the impression that teachers must be very immoral. A teacher can be what he is, and must be himself. He should tell his students, if he's conscious of them, and they ask what his position is, so they can judge him as they judge other people, because he is part of their experience by which they are fashioning their ideas. And he should come quite clean about what person he is. And
so you would argue that there's an intellectual aspect, that is, they could teach the morals as they understand them, or as the students ought to understand them, and they could have a moral influence as a character, as a person.
Oh, I think that, yes, we're all doing this, aren't we? I'm a bit worried about your word teach. When you talk about teach morals, do you mean teach to understand, teach to examine, explore, to criticize, or teach to accept? These are two distinct things.
Well, I don't know if we're ready to move on to that part of that question or not.
Well, I did have one question that I wanted to raise. It seems that once a student is ready for school at approximately age 6, that student already has the patterns of value development laid from the various sources that the child comes into contact with prior to school. The family would perhaps seem to be one of the stronger influences. If we can believe what the psychologists tell us, that this is in fact the case, that the child has these patterns developed in the conceptual sense and by association the value sense, can the school in fact hope to teach values?
Is a child so conditioned that whatever a school does, he'll remain the same?
Exactly.
Well, there may be some truth in this. It was the Jesuits who used to say, did they not give me the child to the age of 7? I don't care who has him afterwards.
That's right.
I'm quite certain many, many basic patterns are formed by home life. I'm not at all convinced that they aren't modified in later life by later experience. I would like to think we're all sensitive, reacting beings, and that we're refining and reviewing and renewing, changing our values all through life. The only one way one can decide this is to look into oneself and say, has this happened? Well, I'm certain in my own case that it has. Certain values imparted to me by my mother have been rejected, and I have become the sort of person which in some way she might well have disapproved of. So I think the foundation, a very firm foundation is laid, but I think these are modified. If you're right, Jeff, let's shut all the schools. If we're finished our self-making by the age of 5, schools have nothing whatever to do.
Of course, we're talking to a limited notion of what values are. That is, that it has something to do with, say, moral behavior,
yes.
so on, being acquainted with the norms,
yes.
that sort of thing. But surely, I value language, let's say. I've made that statement before. I value language. I value, say, rationality. There was a time when I didn't to the same degree that I do now, say.
Yeah.
That has been an educative process because have studied whatever, psychology or literature or philosophy, and come in contact with people who held these and persuaded me through rationality, reason, that it was important. It was an important aspect of man. So I now regard that as being extremely important. So that wouldn't have, I mean, I didn't hold these with the same as precious, let's say, when I was 5.
Well, does that give us some clue to the whole process? You say you have come to value words, you've come to value rationality, but you've not had any lessons on valuing words, and you've not had any lessons on rationality. You have acquired these because you have used words, read words, people have written them. These values have been transmitted in other ways, not directly, and your rationality has come from rational studies of other things. And this, I think, is one of our difficulties, that we can teach values directly. We can't. We can only teach them expressed. In the same way, you cannot teach people to appreciate beauty. You can't see beauty. You can only see a beautiful picture or a beautiful woman. You see it expressed. You can only see values expressed. And sometimes when people say you must teach values, they mean you must recite them to children until they say, I believe them, accept them, which children would do, but not necessarily mean what they say. Value education is there in all education, whatever we do. If you're teaching mathematics and a child submits you a sum, 3 plus 3, and the child puts 5, and you say, well, that's near enough, that's right. You are teaching a value of inaccuracy. And so this is where schools contribute to the whole of their life and all their teaching.
Are you then beginning to argue along the line of Kohlberg and claim that it is developmental, and going along with Lloyd saying that when I began I didn't value these things, but as I became a man I took on different aspects, and this is merely a maturing process?
Oh yes, I think so. I am convinced that there is a maturing. I'm not at all sure that I necessarily accept Kohlberg's 6 stages, but surely Kohlberg's research and those of other people in a similar field have shown that people do in fact change in their judgments, and change, if not exactly at the 10th birthday or whenever it is, fairly consistently. Kohlberg also shows, of course, that some people go further along the road than others.
It would seem to be the task then to ensure that the children would go further along the line, and the question then would become, how do we ensure that?
Yes, you encourage them to develop as fully as you can. How do we ensure it? I suppose, sorry, you wish to come in now.
That's perhaps some clues to that question. We're introduced by what was said. Even granted that there is a pattern of responding instilled in children well before they come to school, I think Lloyd's comments point out that there are whole realms of things about which judgments have to be made which one doesn't know, one isn't in contact with before they come to school. Things such as art and literature and music. Whatever rudimentary experiences there may be in infancy and childhood, it is in school that most children are exposed to those areas which require value judgments and responses.
But sure, we want to claim that there's more than an exposure, and that's the key, I would think, is that it's more than an exposure. How is it more than an exposure? And maybe we're back to the point now, how does the teacher play this role? And I would ask, is it possible for a teacher not to import values into the situation? You had said earlier, well, if they're honest and clear about what they're doing, then that is a big plus on their side. but even if they're honest and clear about it, can they avoid importing values that they have and therefore encouraging kids to accept those values?
No, I don't. I think this is part of the teacher's role, responsibility, to put before his pupils and to express judgments about it. We had in Britain a kind of research some years ago by Lawrence Stenhouse in which he tried to argue that the teacher should be an impartial chairman. It's a jolly dull teacher to begin with. It's psychologically impossible for another reason, and Stenhouse has had to modify his position. Of course we're teaching values. If children pick up values from everything they do and everything they meet, and they meet us, we're part of their experience. And as I say, this is the responsibility of the teacher. That's his job.
Then the job again. I got to go back to my two parts.
Yeah.
would have the part as the character, as the moral referent, and also intellectually as giving knowledge. Is and then the concern is how moral does the teacher have to be as a model?
Yes.
And your claim is that it depends on the age level. Is that?
Yes. There are two parts to this, aren't there? There's the unconscious picking up of values, and there's the rationalization and realizing that you're doing them. And part of the teacher's job is to help children to rationalize themselves. As regards whether the teacher should set himself up as a model paragon, I'm inclined to say no. This is assuming a role which is somewhat self-important.
Why? I think that disturbs me, or that I'm wondering about now, I suppose it's related, is where these values come from that we're going to teach. How, for instance, how can I be concerned about a value without being dogmatic, without indoctrination, while at the same time I don't want to be, say, a complete relativist. It's a really difficult thing. For instance, I look at poetry and I say, this particular poem is self-indulgent. It worships the impulse. It worships feeling. I don't value it. You see? Somebody else might say, well, I think that this is an extremely good poem because I believe the poetry is all feeling. Now, are we both right? I mean, is there any ground that we can go to for clarification? Is there anywhere we can go to come to terms with this? Or are we left saying, I'm right and you're right, or we're both right, or neither is wrong?
Ideally, there is some ground of reference. Whether we can ever get to it is another matter. It may be honest. I think this is very much culturally conditioned, you know, Lloyd. And where you get a society which has pretty agreed values, the teacher can say, this is what you value, what I value, what we all value, and can be thoroughly dogmatic and no one minds. Where you get a plural society like such we have, the teacher who says, this is what you've got to value, is in danger of appearing an indoctrinator and a crank. What he thinks he's got to say is, look, there are various views about this in our society. You will find this group of people taking this point of view. They do not value this poem. There are these people who do value. I myself belong to one of these groups, and these are my reasons. I think you should know them, and I think you should judge whether they are good reasons, whether you can join me or you belong to the other group. I'm all for putting our views firmly, straightly to students, as long as we realize in a plural society we cannot maintain that they're the only views. We may maintain that they are for us the right values, provided we give reasons. And I think if you give reasons, you can't be accused of indoctrination.
Well, that's very interesting because there are people, for instance, I go back to English literature again, who say we ought not to make value judgments. It's a kind of I'm okay, you're okay syndrome. Want to make literature into science, say. We ought not to make value judgments. Now, I believe that the only way we can get anywhere is to make value judgments. That is, for me to say, this is where I stand. These are the reasons. Do you see it my way?
Yes.
Or do you not? If you do not, give me your particular perspective. In that kind of a situation, it seems to me, we both may grow. we both may learn something. Other than that, if I don't put myself on the line, I can't see how we're going to get anywhere at all.
In the example you gave now, Lloyd, it seems to me there are aesthetic values at work, there are cognitive values at work, that is, putting labels on what the contents of the poem is, the worship, self-indulgent,
Right.
so on. And there are moral judgments being expressed, moral values. And I just wonder, with all of those things going on at the same time, whether
I believe
which
that,
would be more appropriate, more suitable for the one who's dealing with literature.
Well, I don't think
or
you
the
can
poem.
separate them, is my view.
Oh.
I believe, for instance, that there's something moral about the form of a poem, for instance. And I the other night, in sort of response to you on that panel, I made the point that there was what is known as concrete poetry. And this kind of poetry, for instance, has words all over the page. There's a kind of randomness. And I believe that there's something about the form of this kind of poetry that says something about my particular values of life and about life.
Mm-hmm.
So I believe form and content are not easily distinguished.
Now, you're a Platonist, are you?
Yes,
There
I
are
am.
some absolute values which we apprehend in greater and lesser degree.
Yes, I think that's true. Be interesting to discuss that, but I think Jeff is trying to.
Well, it's interesting because I think Lloyd and Jim are both talking about a very similar thing, and it's something that has posed some problems in the social studies. I think what they're talking about is this something that I call process, or if you like, methodology. How do we go about doing it rather than what do we do? What we've discussed up until now pretty well has been what, not how. And this has been a concern of mine. And maybe what I'm doing here is making a statement rather than raising a question, but I'm certainly interested to listen to other views. The social studies purports to provide experiences where values education takes place of what is called value clarification. This is an objective process, an application, if you like, as I believe I mentioned at our meeting last week, a scientific method, an objective method of having students identify and then clarify through a process or a procedure the values that they hold. Some of these process models are action-oriented in that students then will discuss amongst themselves in small group situation or large group situation the values that they hold and then put these values up front, so to speak, to be questioned by the rest of the class. Teachers, in their training, unfortunately it would seem, have not been exposed to training that really allows them to manipulate that kind of situation. And there have been problems that have arisen. In the province of Alberta, for instance, there is a social studies program devoted solely to values, experiences and decision-making. The elementary part of the program was called. And some teachers got into a great deal of trouble because they were not able to differentiate in terms of process between values clarification, which is a procedure to clarify values, and valuing, which I define as pretty close to indoctrination, the teaching of values. This is the value that I hold, this is the value that you will hold as being the value. And I'm not sure whether perhaps teachers are trained enough, sufficient enough, are good enough role models to be involved in that kind of experience, at least in the area of social studies. Now, it raises all sorts of questions, and maybe some of you on the panel here might want to respond to it.
Well, if I understood you, Jeff, you were saying there are two parts to this process. There's an examination of what values are indeed held by the individual or society. That's an empirical process. There is perhaps then the question of what values should they hold? Are these the right values? And this seems to be a perfectly good procedure But provided the teacher at that stage is sufficiently flexible and astute to say, well, we will discuss this is a value judgment. If he at that point says these are the values you've got to hold or should hold, then of course it does become indoctrination, doesn't it?
Mm-hmm. Yes.
Now, supposing though, for instance, as I keep thinking through this, it strikes me that there might be certain values that we could say that about. If we might be able to say, look, X, you must value the individual. At a sufficient level of generality, we might be able to say that you, if you are to remain human, must value the individual, must value fairness and justice, you see. Whereas when it comes to interpreting that in order to have you make a particular decision, let's take abortion, for instance. I say, I value human dignity and human life. That helps me take a certain stand about abortion. But there may be somebody else who equally is concerned about human life, who takes the opposite stand about abortion. You see. That at some level of generality, maybe we can be dogmatic.
I think we can. I think there are some general things about care for others, value for human life. There are certain parts of the world where it would be difficult to get that agreed with. But I should thought in Western society we could arrive at some general values here. As you so wisely point out, Lloyd, it's a question of how those things are expressed. And when many people talk about value teaching, they have in mind a particular way of expressing values. And what they very often mean is not teaching a value such as we've been, at the level we've been discussing it, but conditioning children to behave in a particular way.
But you would argue that there are some things that we ought to condition students to behave. Well, let me not say you would argue that. Let me say I would argue that we ought not have kids be bullies. And that's a universal. And every time we see kids bullying other kids, we ought not to allow them to do that. We ought to step right in there. And we would do that as a conditioning, I suppose.
Yes. Oh yes, you see, there are different. Each society has a different set of values. We are decided about certain things. We're undecided about others. When I was young, we were quite decided about sex and things and drugs and so on. Nowadays, that's an open choice. We put much more responsibility on the young. And each age, as I see it, has certain set values and certain fluid ones. We may appear to have more fluid ones because they're bugging us at the moment. Mm-hmm. But underneath all this, there are certain agreements which we could clarify. And I think this is probably the way forward for us to get together and say, these are the values which we are generally agreed. Individuals may, at odd moments, flout them. But as a whole, we're going to stand for this. Mm-hmm. There are other values which we cannot be so dogmatic at the moment, and those are the ones that are troubling us. And those are the ones that we're demanding should be taught in school.
To impose a value then, can we then say from that perhaps the ones that are troubling us now are the ones that we should be focusing on?
Oh yes, I think because they're troublesome, we haven't got them clear. But I do not think you can be dogmatic about them in school while society is confused.
Is there some reason why we can't refer back to those that are foundational to provide guidance for us? Because it doesn't seem that as a possible school subject or even in the way that society operates, that's what we're doing.
Yeah, you give me quite a good idea, Jeff. What we've done is that we have broken off the link between our basic values and certain sets of action.
Yeah, see, this is
we haven't made that reference. Yeah, that is why we're uncertain. If we can make the link, we shall solve the problem. For instance, you mentioned abortion. Yeah. We are uncertain about this because we cannot see how that links up with care for human life in every case.
Yeah. See, people say, well, sure, you ought to be able to get an abortion on demand because, and the reason they might give is, I cannot afford an abortion. Now, that seems to me to be a rather flimsy argument. I would rather go to something more fundamental, about what it says about human life, for instance, and so on. But no, probably we ought to, may I raise a different sort of issue, that is, what kind of a program do we visualize as sort of taking care of, in a sense, values education in the schools? I'd like to get somebody's opinion on that, because we can leave it to the subject areas, say social studies, history, philosophy, sociology, literature, we can develop perhaps a sort of interdisciplinary subject called values, or we can I don't know. Whatever.
I hesitate to put our guest on the spot with that question. It will be perhaps a useful place to, by way of some type of response to that question, close the formalities of this interview and discussion, and any other matters that you would want to focus attention on for the sake of further discussion.
Well, of course, Lloyd's asked the real question: how do we do it? If we knew, we'd be doing it. That is the problem. We seem to have come quite a way this afternoon. In fact, no, that there is a concern in society about value judgments, that the schools can contribute something towards it, but the children bring already from outside values from the home and so on. We hope that we can, through our various disciplines, rather than by any structured program, help them to modify and clarify those views, that the teacher will have his own value system and behavior, and that without necessarily being a model of virtue, should be prepared to discuss this with the children. We think that possibly part of our difficulty is that although we have certain tacitly agreed fundamental values, we have cut these off from certain areas of experience, and that is causing trouble. And if we can express these tacit values through our other disciplines, children will be picking them up, and we shall in that way be influencing them, and they will in their turn be taking their conscious realizations out into the world, and schools will therefore be one of the socializing agencies by which we shall work through to some more agreed moral system.
We've been concerned today with the question, can we teach values in the schools? We've had our discussion, and our hope is that we've contributed to further discussion on the part of those who may be viewing this. Our thanks to Edwin Cox, Jim Covert, Lloyd Brown, Jeff Jones. Good day.